Hi everyone, welcome back. It's me again here for week number 7. If you haven't done so already, make sure you see the introduction to this week video. I'm going to jump right into the lecture now. We're going to have quite a few for this week, a lot to pack in. If you've read chapter 20, if you've done some of the learning curve, summative quizzes, you just know how much there is here. So I'm going to dive right into lecture. Make sure you see kind of the introduction weekly recap video in order to get a little bit of background on what's expected from you this week, and a synopsis of both the primary source discussion and the weekly response post. So this week, week number 7, we're looking at the world at war, right? We're going to really look at kind of global political and social tensions and powers that changed between 1900 and 1950. And ultimately, if you haven't already seen the weekly recap video, you know, your basic weekly response post asks you to talk a little bit about how the world in 1945, right at the end of this time frame, was so much different than the world in 1914. So something you want to pay attention to during this discussion. So our driving questions for this first lecture, it's going to ask you, the driving question I'm really focused on here is, European historians in particular will tell you that there had been relative peace, right? There had been war, but then there had been relative peace in Europe since the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. But is this true when looking globally? That's what we're going to focus on in this lecture. Then we'll look at the First World War and why it was so different from other previous wars. In the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about how World War II was really just a continuation of World War I, at least in this historian's opinion and in some others. And then we'll kind of summarize it all up at the end and talk about how the world in 1945 was so different from the world in 1914. You really do need to watch all of these lectures. I'm going to hit a lot of things that aren't necessarily covered in the textbook and hopefully do a pretty good job explaining some of the things I think they move too quickly through. So let's rewind the clock a little bit. We have to go all the way back to the end of the French Revolution, the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. Remember, Napoleon had kind of came to power during the French Revolution. The French Revolution looked very different from the American Revolution. One historian compares the French Revolution to a snowball that rolls down a hill. You know, it starts off with some productivity, but as it gets bigger and bigger, it gets out of control until it kind of steamrolls the whole village at the end of the hill there. And this is the way the French Revolution worked. Napoleon comes to power in 1779, just before the turn of the 19th century. Napoleon comes to power, and by 1803, he's named himself an emperor. So you have a revolution that's against monarchy in the beginning, but ends up with an emperor. And not only that, Napoleon is a very militaristic emperor. He looks at the French Revolution and the ideas behind the French Revolution and says, not only should France protect itself from other kingdoms that didn't want any part of the French Revolution, like Great Britain, like a number of principalities within the German Confederation, Italy, and he says it's our job to bring the ideas of the French Revolution to all of Europe. So Napoleon goes on to conquer pretty much most, if not all, of continental mainland Europe. He never conquers Great Britain, and then he makes a huge mistake when he tries to invade Russia. His army is defeated and he's forced to retreat into the German Confederation, where he is defeated finally in 1815. And so in 1815, the powers of Europe meet in the Congress of Vienna. Vienna, you can see right there in the Austrian Empire. And the man that I've got pictured up in the upper right is kind of the mind behind the new peace that's created in 1815. This peace is often called the Concert of Europe. The idea was actually very simple. Clemens von Metternich wanted to create a balance of power, right? What he saw the biggest problem facing Europe in 1815 was an imbalance of power. If France got too powerful, if Russia got too powerful, if Austria got too powerful, or the Papal States, if one of these empires, or the Ottoman Empire down there you can see in the Balkans, if one of these empires got too powerful, von Metternich argued, the rest of Europe would be dropped into a war. And so what von Metternich did is he tried to ensure that no one empire could become more powerful than the other. And the way he did this was he said, okay, we'll have France on one side, we'll have Russia on the other. In the middle will be a German confederation, not a single state. Right there, as you can see, Bavaria, Prussia, within these kind of other states of the German Confederation, and then the Austrian Empire. And the point of this kind of map drawing was to create a balance of power and to ensure that no one empire could disrupt that balance. And European historians look at this balance of power and say, look, it lasted from 1815 until 1914, basically a century of relative peace. That's not exactly true, especially as we've learned in this class when you think globally. Think back to 2 weeks ago where we talked about the scramble for Africa. Sure, Europeans might not have been fighting in Europe, but they deployed their modernizing armies in other regions of the world. One of them, where it's quite clear, is in Africa. Following the lead of Leopold II and Belgium, other European nations scrambled to divide Africa between themselves, which they do successfully during the Berlin Conference, which took place between 1884 and 1885. You can see a map in the upper left of what Africa looked like before the Berlin Conference. Lots of colonization going on, but there are still large parts of the continent that are not colonized. And then the map in 1913, just before the First World War, all of the African continent, for the most part, was colonized by the European powers. So while Europeans might not have been fighting in Europe, that is, the balance of power seems to be holding, they were deploying their energy, their military energy, in other places, and one of them being Africa. And we talked a lot about how native people in Africa were the victims of this kind of militarization and the use of force. So, if you look at Africa in the 19th century, this relative peace seems to really fall apart. There's not peace in Africa. There's colonization, which is quite brutal and certainly detracts from the idea that there is relative peace. As we learned last week, there's also a decent amount of colonization and the exertion of military strength in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, parts of China, what's called then French Indochina, later becomes Vietnam, or Siam, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines. And I've just got a list here, not that you have to memorize these or anything, but just an example of how all of these kind of military energies, while they weren't being fought in Europe, they were being fought in other parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and in China, probably most explicitly, as we saw last week and we talked a little bit about. So, I really want to deconstruct that idea that Europe was in relative peace, because even though the continent itself, there wasn't much fighting there, although there was some, if you look more globally at the rest of the world, that peace of Europe idea really kind of falls apart. And another important thing to note is that in Europe during the time that's called the Peace of Europe between 1815 and 1914, one really significant event stands out, and that is the unification of Germany. So if I rewind again, I like to jump around this lecture, but if I rewind, you'll notice that German Confederation, you see Bavaria and Prussia, the two kind of largest German states, but there's also Hamburg up in the north there. Germany was divided, and this was part of Clemens von Metternich's plan. As long as Prussia, Bavaria, Hamburg, the other municipalities and principalities of Germany stayed divided, the balance was whole, because it really created kind of a buffer state, right? A state in between the power of France, the Austrian Empire, and Russia. It was a kind of a release valve for all of the tensions of Europe. But in the 1860s, much to the chagrin of someone like Clemens von Metternich, if he were still alive in the 1860s, Germany is going to unite. And, we could talk about there could be a whole nother week on just the unification of Germany. We could talk about Otto von Bismarck, we could talk about blood and iron, we can talk about what it means for Deutschland, Germany, to unite. But the most important thing to note, as this political cartoon demonstrates to you, is that the unification of Germany really threw that balance of power up into the air. You can see in this political cartoon, Deutschland, right, Germany, pulling at the kind of coattails of the French. And this is because the Germans were very antagonistic towards the French. During the Prusso-Franken War of the 1860s, early 1870s, the Germans are going to seize a portion of France. So you can see that the unification of Germany is already upsetting that balance of power because the Germans are antagonistic towards the French. But notice who else looks perturbed by the unification of Germany. You've also got Russland, right, the Russians over here to the east of Deutschland, who are also perturbed by the unification of Germany, because not only were the Germans antagonistic towards the French, but they could also be antagonistic towards the Russians. You should also take a note here. Look, Great Britain looking down at Germany, obviously with some sort of concern about what's going on. You'll notice here, southeastern Europe, there being a bit of kind of problems too. You'll notice that The Ottomans right here, the Turkish empires, European Turkish, right? Right there. The Ottoman Empire, which was based over here in what's now Turkey, extended to southeastern Europe. So even though there's peace in Europe and there's a balance of power, quote unquote, there's ultimately some unrest. And this unrest is really going to take off towards the late 19th century, early 20th century, and largely because of alliances that are created. The first alliance is going to be created between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Although, for the sake of this lecture and keeping things simple, the third power, so you have Germany here, Austria-Hungary here, Italy, you'll notice, eventually sides with the Allies, and the Ottoman Empire will side with the Germans. So for the sake of ease, we'll just replace Italy with the Ottoman Empire here. You have this triple alliance. So now that balance of power, which is already thrown off by an independent Germany and a unified Germany, is thrown off again by this new alliance that is putting powers into a single group. Equally important is the Franco-Russian alliance that's created just after, only a decade after the Triple Alliance. And that's where France will get into a alliance with Russia. And the reason why, right? France and Russia really don't have any of the same interests. Russia at this time is still a monarchy. The Tsar is in control of Russia. France has obviously gone through many revolutions by this point, but it no longer has a monarchy. So why were the French and the Russians willing to work together? Because of the Germans. They had a mutual enemy. And this was the Germans. So they agreed that if Germany kind of declared war on one of them, that the other would declare war on Germany. And then the Entente Cordiale, which is in 1904, is where England, who had long been an enemy of France, signs kind of a secretive agreement with the French Republic, agreeing that if any war breaks out, the English will come to the aid of the French. And this is because the English also viewed Germany with a bit of disdain. Importantly, the Germans under Otto von Bismarck, when they unified, created a very strong navy. And this navy challenged British naval dominance, which existed all the way back to the 1770s. So the English, for the same reason as the French and the Russians, are going to get in an alliance with France, being that they both have a distrust of Germany. But interestingly enough, and Otto von Bismarck, the guy who unified Germany, has a really famous quote, and I'll paraphrase to an extent. He says, you know, if the next war begins, it's going to begin in the Balkans. Where is the Balkans? The Balkans is this region of southeastern Europe, that area that was under control of the Ottoman Empire. And importantly, the Ottoman Empire, who we talked about a little bit about last week, if you did your reading closely, was known as the sick men of Europe. They were really losing power, especially in southeastern Europe. And what this meant was that as one nation loses power, another gains it. And Austria-Hungary, this empire that was also kind of waning, at least in European power, was trying to exert its power in Southeast Asia. In Southeastern Europe, in the Balkan regions. And so what does that create, right? It creates a tinderbox, a small spark, even something that's seemingly insignificant could start a very big war. And that's exactly what happens. You can read through kind of the odds and ends here I've got on this slide. But Serbia, which is a nation that had become independent from the Ottoman Empire, was really looking to exert its control in southeastern Europe. And they had the backing of the Russians because the Serbs and the Russians come from similar nationalist ideologies. They both speak similar languages. They're seen to be Slavic people, meaning that they share a common ancestry. And this makes them very different than Austria-Hungary. So what happens is Austria-Hungary, who's also trying to exert its control in southeastern Europe, the Austro-Hungarians send the heir to the throne. Austro-Hungary is an empire, and the heir to the throne is a man by the name of Franz Ferdinand. They send Franz Ferdinand to the Balkans to try to demonstrate Austro-Hungarian control and power in the region. A young man, only 19 years old, part of a terrorist organization, a nationalist Serbian terrorist organization, they believed in anarchy, shoots and kills Franz Ferdinand as he tours the city of Sarajevo. His name is Gavrilo Princip. Princip assassinates Franz Ferdinand. And what this does is it begins a very long, and it's only actually a couple months long, but it's a very drawn-out process. I recommend this book, The Guns of August. It explains all about the beginnings of the First World War. But Austria-Hungary looks to move against the Serbians, which brings the Russians in against Austria-Hungary, which means the Germans are going to declare war on Russia, which means the French are going to declare war on the Germans, which means the Germans are going to declare war on France. And when they do so, we talk a little bit about this in the next lecture, it begins World War I. I'll come back and start with this slide exactly, but the key here is the transfer of power.